I, ever since I moved to Colorado, I've been wondering what I'm going to do with the knowledge that I might acquire about Colorado liverworts. I thought, do I do a book? Do I just have the collections? Do I just have notes? And I haven't really totally answered that question, but I did decide that it would be good for a number of reasons to especially my own amusement, I will say, is to pick out liverworts that I've come to know and love and make stories about them. It's how I like to do things. I like to tell the story of it, especially I like liverworts that have a story that brings in some other elements just besides liverwort taxonomy. So to my inaugural lovely Colorado liverwort, what I'd like to introduce you to is one called Mesoptychia bantriensis, whose common name is the bantry notchwort. And it likes to live in Colorado and probably everywhere in areas that are always wet. It does not like to be dry. So along stream sides, um, seepage areas and so forth is a good place to find it. Theoretically, it likes calcareous areas. I'm not sure that's actually been documented as thoroughly as you might like, but that is what is said about it. And these are just some pictures that somewhere in there is some Bantry notchwort. Those are my own pictures. These are better pictures close up of this plant from the British Bryological Society website. It is kind of your basic leafy liverwort. It's got succubusly inserted leaves, which means you can see the lower margin of the leaf, not the other one. The leaves are arranged like a shingle. The leaves are shallowly bilobed, and it grows in sort of a tufted way. It's kind of a yellow to a clear green, sometimes sort of brownish. Looking at it a little bit more closely, some other features that are important is this is the underside, amongst the tangle of rhizoids that line the underside, there are little underleaves. Takes a little work to see them, but there's an underleaf there. And then here's a stem where I've taken off the rhizoids, or there weren't very many. Here's another underleaf. When you look at them slightly more closely, the underleaves have funny little cells, clear cells at the base. We call these slime papillae. I don't know whether what that really has ever meant, honestly, whether they produce slime or whether or not, I don't know. But anyway, that's what we call them. The cellular level are a number of distinctive features. It has rather large cells. These can be up to 50 to 55 micrometers across. It has large bulging trigones. It has something on the order of 3 to 8 ellipsoid bumpy oil bodies per cell. And a really interesting feature are these striations. There are uneven thickenings in the cuticle of the leaf that lead to these kind of elongated, lumpy things that stick up. When you look at it under low magnification, it looks like striations. When you get up closer, they're not really long striations. They're just sort of irregular, elongate deposits of cell wall thickening material. But it's very easy to see, very distinctive. Another thing that's very distinctive about this plant and everything that is in the genus with it is the perianth, which you don't see a lot because most of them are dioicous, but it has a cylindrical perianth that constricts very suddenly at the apex without any kind of folds along the sides. It's a cylinder that just becomes constricted, then it has a short beak. And it also has would be the gynoecial bract. It has gynoecial bracts, which are larger than the lateral leaves and are kind of undulate along the margin. So Mesoptychia, it's a name I love. I love me a Greek-derived name. It means folded leaf. And it's a name that there's an awful lot of other names that have been given to this plant. I would have learned it back in the 70s from Rudy Schuster as a member of Lophosia subgenus Lyocolia. But that turns out to be especially when you consider that this is now put in the Jungermanniaceae, not in the Lophosiaceae, where it was previously, the oldest name turns out to be Mesoptychia. which is really fun to say and to spell. Um, and the species name has a whole lot of synonyms too. So clearly a lot of people, mostly Europeans, have had very different ideas about what this plant is. Its species name bantriensis is one of the charming things about it. The name Bantry, oops, I'm sorry about that. Bantry comes from County Cork in Ireland. Bantry is here. And it gets that name because it was first collected by a woman named Ellen Hutchins, who lived in Ballylickey, which is in the Bantry area. She turns out to be Ireland's first female botanist. She did not live very long. She died at 29. And she lived, but she spent her whole life living in this area. And she was a naturalist extraordinaire, collecting a lot of specimens of marine algae as well as bryophytes, and I think lichens as well. And we have no idea what she looks like. That's kind of that isn't a picture of her clearly. That's somebody dressed up like she might have been. Most of what we know about her is because of her correspondence, which has been studied extensively by a descendant of hers named Madeline Hutchins, who's written a book about Ellen and has really promoted her work. And that's led to her being recognized as a natural history pioneer in Ireland, and also some books that can be, this one can actually, this is a children's guide to bryophytes of the Bantry area, and which you can download. And then there's another book that you can buy. I knew of Miss Hutchins because of specimens like this one up in the upper left-hand corner at the New York Botanical Garden in the herbarium of William Mitten. There were thousands of specimens that said Bantry Miss Hutchins on them, and I never paid really a whole lot of attention to them because I wasn't particularly interested in, the European collections. But Mrs. Madeline Hutchins, who is a historian by training, came to visit and was thrilled. It turns out that most of the specimens that Ellen collected, the originals, ended up at the New York Botanical Garden basically because Kew didn't want them. And they went to this man named William Mitten, who did a lot of identification for him. And then we bought his herbarium. So the picture shows the house where she lived. She was not of a wealthy family. They were more middle class, and they weren't the owners of this Ballylickey property. They were the caretakers. And her father was sort of a high-class smuggler, a very genteel sort of smuggler who died early on. And while Ellen was off being educated in, advanced education for women, whatever that consisted of, in Dublin, her father died, and her older brother, who would have taken over the estate shortly after that happened, was paralyzed from the neck down, and her mother was in very ill health. So Ellen had to give up her studies and come back and basically manage the household. Turns out she was in poor health too. I don't know whether it was, tuberculosis, could have been. It was a very bad time in Ireland. This is just on the cusp of the potato famine, where lots of people got sick. We know about Ellen because of her voluminous correspondence. There's a picture of one of her letters, which I'm very glad I did not have to be the one to transcribe. But she wrote voluminously to botanists all over the British Isles, especially to Dawson Turner, who was primarily an Irish phycologist, algal person. And I liked a couple of quotes in this letter. I think we will all find it endearing that all mosses are very much so, meaning interesting. Nothing delights me more than the sight of a great rock covered with a variety of mosses. In winter, the rich shades of green they afford are very beautiful. I have a rock in my little flower garden, the north side of which is freely covered with mosses and ferns. The other quote that's highlighted here is one where she says, I hope Mr. Hooker will soon give us the Jungermanii, his large work on liverworts. The reason she was interested in Mr. Hooker coming up with this is because it was somebody who was going to be, who would go on to contribute a lot of information for that. The person she's referring to is William Jackson Hooker, who was the founder of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, and he and his son really built that institution There are many biographies of him. The one that we all wanted as grad students to have on our bookshelves to snigger at was Mia Allen's The Hookers of Kew, which is, despite its title, is actually a nice biography of the two of them. Anyway, British Jungomanii was the first important work on the liverworts of the British Isles. It's a beautiful, big folio-sized book, and it consists of these plates, like are shown on the left, colored plates, and then associated with each plate is a description. Now, this plate is Jungomania stipulosa, which is actually what we would call today Harpanthus scutatus, and it's in the write-up of that one that he mentions, oh, this is very close to another new species, Jungomania bantriensis, which has lately been discovered by Miss Hutchins and blah blah blah. Then that basically stands as the description of bantriensis, which meant that name was overlooked for a long time because it is a valid description apparently, but it doesn't really feel like one. It wasn't featured, but it has most of the elements that you would expect. So she contributed, I don't know how many of the species Miss Hutchins contributed to this book, but it was a fair number. So it's nice to honor her in that way. Turns out that this species under another name has been known for a long time from Colorado, but it's been pretty obscure. So one of the first expedition that really collected many bryophytes in Colorado was Lieutenant Wheeler's expedition. His expeditions of the West to map and to document the western part of the United States went on over several years. But in the summer of 1873, he had a contingent led by a lieutenant marshal that had two botanists on it, Joseph Rothrock, who was from Pennsylvania, and John Wolfe, about whom it's too common a name. I haven't been able to find out a whole lot about him. But anyway, Wolfe and Rothrock made their way with the expedition. The area in gray on this map, it's a very confusing map. But anyway, basically they made their way from the Denver area to the Four Corners area during the course of that summer and collected plants. Their vascular plans often will give some localities. Their bryophyte collections rarely do. They just say Colorado territory. That's about it. There's quite a few of them. They're widely distributed, and they were written up and identified by a New Jersey bryologist named Co. Austin. Oops. And this is a paper by Alexander Evans, which was kind of the first checklist of Colorado bryophytes, which contains the Wheeler expedition collections and then 5 species that were collected by T.S. Brandegee, who was a California botanist. But anyway, among the species that Austin listed were a J. hornschuiana, which turns out to be a synonym of Mesoptychia bantriensis, and here's one of those specimens. I haven't looked at it. I don't know for sure it's actually that, but it could be. So even though it's been known for a long time, it has not been well known. I mean, Rudy Schuster, who even though he wrote voluminously on every species, didn't write much about this one because it hardly occurs in his flora area in North America east of the 100th meridian. It's really, as he points out, it's a Western species. And among the remarks that dropped out at me, as he says, there was a very old, with an old and very dubious report from Colorado, meaning the specimen, which he could well have looked at if he'd wanted to, because there's lots of them distributed around. But anyway, he chose to not do that because he wasn't actually working on Western liverworts. Weber and Whitman include the species, but you get the feeling they did not know it well. They say that Wansek Hong reported it without citations from what seems to have either been Larimer or Montezuma County. And the only specimen they knew was one from Trail Ridge Road by Keener, which I assume was probably in the 40s or 50s, based on when Keener collected. So it's, not well known. But when you look at the distribution on the Bryophyte Consortium, you can see on the left is its western distribution. So it's got a number of points. And then on the right are the collections. The blue ones up in the upper right-hand corner are the ones I assume from Kahlo. But then my collections are the ones in green, and I've collected it in a few in the Front Range, the base of Mount or we used to be called Mount Squaw Mountain, Mistihi, I think is the name now. I collected it at Blue Lakes where we were last summer, the vicinity of Leadville, and then also down in the San Juans. So it's here. It's not the only member of the genus Mesoptychia that occurs in Colorado. There's several. They all look distressingly similar, but they actually can be told apart for the most part. I will have a proviso about that. But anyway, there are these other species. Heterocolpus, the one, there's bantriensis. Heterocolpus has gemmy, usually lots of gemmy. The others don't, so you can tell that one pretty quickly. Vidensis is teeny tiny, so bantriensis can be up to 3 millimeters across, and this one, sorry, there's a typo there. There should be no 9. It's 0.3 to 0.6 micrometers wide, teeny little thing, and usually doesn't have any underleaves at all. Colaris is a species a little bit more problematic to differentiate. It's got smaller cells. But that's the main thing. And then there's this other species, Mesoptychia gilmanii, which has not been reported from Colorado, but it's known from Wyoming. It's reported from Arizona and Utah, California. And this is a picture from Dave Wagner from Oregon. The only thing that's really differentiates it well from bantriensis is that while bantriensis is dioicous, gilmanii is paroicous. But so it may be here. It just may be we haven't seen it yet. It's hard to believe it isn't here, but it's a little bit unknown. There's really only one phylogenetic paper that's been done on Mesoptychia. It was done back in 2013, but it's sort of refreshing that the group holds together. At here you can see the clade up here where it appears, and it's also refreshing that the ones that are the easiest to tell apart also are the farthest apart phylogenetically. Heterocolpus, the one with gemmy, is down here. Vidensis, the little teeny guy, is here. And then up here we have, on very short branches, bantriensis and colaris, and Mesoptychia maybe just a little bit farther away. So it's a nice example of where the genes and the morphology seem to actually overlap pretty nicely. So there are also some very close lookalikes that are not related at all. But it's got our friend the Notchworts have a very kind of classic liverwort morphology, at least for North America. Succubus leaves, slightly bifid, kind of prostrate in the way they grow. And so here are some other things which look distressingly similar again. However, they are and all of these are known from Colorado. I've not seen Geocalyx graveolens here. It's known from here, but I've not seen it. I've collected obtusifolia or Lophosia obtusa only once, Harpanthus scutatus a few times, and this one's everywhere, pallescens. So there are a number of characters that separate them. The easiest way to tell these apart, if you're trying, is to focus on the underleaves and the rhizoids. So here's that same picture of bantriensis. You see the underleaves here are this lanceolate thing. And in obtusifolia, this is a terrible picture, but actually there is a teeny tiny triangular underleaf here of about 4 cells. And there's a bunch of dirt that's kind of gotten stuck under it, which I was afraid to remove because I was afraid I would just pull the whole thing off. Schuster's picture of it shows also extremely tiny. So those are a little bit similar. There are ways to tell these apart and other features. The perianth, for example, in obtusifolia is plicate, not a sharply constricted cylinder, as in Mesoptychia. This one also, obtusifoliosa, has gemmy, but underleaves, they're pretty close. Harpanthus, which is the one that that Hooker actually said, that Mesoptychia looks a lot like. The easiest way to tell it has big underleaves, which are sort of irregular, and they're almost always attached to one of the lateral leaves. So that's a good distinctive way. It has scattered rhizoids. Geocalyx and Chylocyphus, when you flip them over and look at their bellies, you see that they both have bifid underleaves. In Geocalyx, they're rather large, kind of plain bifid underleaves with rhizoids that are at the base of the underleaf, but also sort of scattered on the stem as well. And Chylocyphus, the underleaves are bifid, but they've got a little side tooth on each underleaf. And here the rhizoids really are quite restricted to the underleaf base. So even though they look, as I say, distressingly similar on the top, when you flip them over and use some magnification, you can tell them apart, which is very satisfying. But there are a number of questions remaining that I have. First of all, is what we are calling M. bantriensis, or really any of the Mesoptychias in America, the same as the European species? As far as I know, there's been no phylogenetic analysis of this group in North America. I see some differences morphologically, but those might just be minor environmental modifications. That is work that needs to be done. And then there's this question of whether Bantriensis choleraris and Gilmanii are really distinct species. They can be differentiated, but they are somewhat similar. And I'm guessing there's probably a lot of misidentification. So it really would be a very good service to go through and look at all existing collections and see if they can be told apart. Things like cell size, those can be ranges. I mean, I can't think of all the times in my work when I worked on tropical liverworts how often distinctions like that got broken down when you looked at enough specimens. So who knows? Still needs to be studied. And of course, we don't know. It's so interesting. Gilmanii again. It's Autoicus porocus rather than Dioicus, and it's supposed to be a non-calciphile, but I'm sort of suspicious of that. I'm not sure how you tell necessarily if something's a calciphile. I don't know any objective way you can look at a geological map, but beyond that, I'm not sure how you tell. So that would be interesting to explore some more and exactly, how calciphilic they really are. But again, the need is for more collections, which would help to answer that. Okay, I'm done.